When talking about fascism, people from the top of the NSDAP and Dr. Death are usually on the tongue. That is, 10 morally depraved individuals consisting of Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, Göring, Bormann, Herzog, Höss, Keitel, Rosenberg, and Mengele. At the same time, few people will point out the names of the direct executors of the gloomy fantasies of these 10 non-humans, except for Ilse Koch, who asked to sew gloves and lampshades from the skin of prisoners, and the infamous pedophile Delevangne, whose multinational division in total killed the most people in the world in the entire history of its existence. But there is still a demonic dozen of perverts who took pleasure in torture and murder from their powers. And in today's episode, we will talk about them. The most cruel trio of them is at the end of the episode. So, we begin. Eugen Fischer. The future professor of medicine grew up in Karlsruhe, the land of Baden, in a family of pure-blooded German bookworms. Therefore, he became interested in 3 sciences at once: medicine, anthropology, and ethnography. The man studied each discipline in different universities in Germany. He helped the NSDAP adapt eugenics to the needs of the Third Reich. In reality, this alone would have been enough for punishment in 1945 in the form of a gallows. But Fischer also did monstrous things, hiding behind a third medical diploma. He sterilized 600 children. Their parents are Franco-African soldiers. This was even before the entry of the sinister representative of these 3 sciences into the NSDAP. After that, he received an even bigger role in this killing machine called the Third Reich, ordering on the territory of the Aryan Empire who should have children and who should not. He studied the pain threshold and other reactions of Jews, Gypsies, and Germans of African descent. In 1942, the man retired, thereby falling out of attention. He hid in the countryside residence. Fischer died in 1967. Elfriede Lena Rinkel. A rather little-known individual, although the results of her sadistic feats were perhaps as bloody as those of the infamous Irma Grese. During the war, Elfriede Lena Rinkel worked as a warden at the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Statistics can't lie. During the year when Elfriede was in the camp, more than 10,000 people died: children, the elderly, and women. Surviving witnesses remembered a young SS woman who loved to set dogs on prisoners and watch them die bleeding and screaming. At the end of the World War II, the warden managed not only to escape, but, what is even more astonishing, to marry a Jew who managed to escape the Holocaust. It may seem totally unbelievable, but this one is not a speculation. The executioner's husband was the German Jew Fred William Rinkel. It's impossible to establish today whether this was a competent calculation, but the couple managed to get a visa to the United States in 1959, where this woman and her husband lived happily until 2004. It should be noted that when applying for a visa, Elfriede Lena Rinkel decided not to mention the reality of her service in the auxiliary units of the SS itself. The status of her husband, a Holocaust survivor, opened doors to almost any country on Earth. And only when Fred William Rinkel died, representatives of the Department of Justice became interested in his wife. When the husband's relatives found out who their daughter-in-law really was, they fell into a state of deep shock. Relatives thought that this is nonsense and simply false, because even on the tombstone of Rinkel, buried on the Jewish cemetery in San Francisco under the Star of David, the names of both Fred and Elfriede were engraved in advance. Moreover, according to American lawyer Allison Dixon, the former warden was actually involved in charity. "I just know that she made donations to Jewish charities," he said. Some defenders of the criminal even agreed that she married a Jew and secretly attended the synagogue in order to atone for her own sins before the Jewish people. Though, oddly enough, these arguments did not convince the US authorities, and the already 84-year-old Elfriede was forced to leave the United States as deported and deprived of US citizenship for crimes against humanity committed during World War II. Concentration camp guards like her played a major role in the horrific treatment of innocent victims of Nazism, says Alice Fischer, a Justice Department lawyer. Arriving in Germany, Elfriede, awaiting trial, settled with her sister. True though, the old woman did not live to see the appropriate verdict, dying before the start of the trial. Elfriede Rinkel became the first Nazi criminal to be deported from the United States as part of the investigation of crimes against humanity during World War II. Alois Brunner. The Austrian was born in an average family of his time. He hated the work of his family, peasants. Although he became a successful entrepreneur, in order to make his way into the world even faster, he joined the Nazis who created the Third Reich in Europe. Even though he was a dropout, the clever Brunner managed to develop effective equipment for the first stage of the disposal of the Untermensch in the death camps. We are talking in this chapter about a system of gas chambers. Jews were persuaded that they were invited to wash. Carbon monoxide was supplied from shower heads. There were benches nearby for convenient undressing. Everything was like in a washing room. And not only that, a high official of the Central Administration for the Eviction of Jews also developed mobile gas chambers. After all, in Greece, where he began his activity, there were no concentration camps with tricky showers. The disposal functionary brought Alfred Rosenberg's development to its final stage of development. An Estonian German, who even before Hitler developed the theory of racial superiority, taking into account all the available experience of segregating thinkers. By joining the SS, this directly stands for the extermination of Jews, Brunner became involved in the extermination of no less than 130,000 innocent civilians in Southern and Central Europe. But it's not a matter of quantity, where he can't compete with Eick, Globocnik, and Delewange. Brunner was an obvious bloody pervert, a sadist. He proved this after the war by torturing people. Agile Alois is one of those who managed to avoid Nuremberg. Being the first to rush about moving out of the Third Reich, he changed his mask. The criminal died in 2001. Hertha Oberhauser. This woman is unique in that she was the only representative of the fair sex who was accused at the Nuremberg trial of being part of murderous doctors. In 1937, after graduating as a dermatologist, Hertha joined the Nazi Party and began working at the Physiological Institute in Bonn. But this was not enough for this girl. She dreamed of career growth. So there was nothing surprising in the fact that in 1940, Oberhauser responded to the recruitment of doctors for the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Naturally, doctors in Ravensbrück were recruited not to treat prisoners, but to conduct medical experiments. In this camp, female prisoners and their children acted as guinea pigs. This monstrous project was directed by Himmler's personal physician, Karl Gebhardt, who was assisted by Oberhauser, as well as by assistant Fritz Fischer, camp doctors Rolf Rosenthal, and Gerhard Schidlowski. The main direction of sadistic doctors was to study the capabilities of the body in extreme conditions. Prisoners were deliberately wounded and then tried to treat with experimental dangerous drugs. In some experimental subjects, wounds were specially treated with mud. Foreign bodies, such as glass, iron, were brought into them, and then an examination was carried out and the patient's condition was recorded. After the fall of the Third Reich, Oberhauser was detained and brought before the Nuremberg Tribunal as a defendant in the case of Nazi doctors. Despite the evidence presented to the court, Oberhauser categorically refused to admit her direct guilt. The woman first assured that she was sent to work in the camp forcibly, then that experiments on prisoners were not a crime. She tried to explain that, on the contrary, getting into the experimental division guaranteed the prisoners better living conditions, enhanced nutrition, and even medical care. Oberhauser preferred to keep silent about the fact that prisoners died from infections and injections for a long time and really painfully. Despite all the arguments of the accused, the court sentenced Hertha Oberhauser to 20 years in prison. The further fate of the female executioner is unknown. Theodor Eicke, a native German individual from Lorraine, which is why he hated the French as much as the Führer. At the time the Nazis came to power, Theodor was a patient in clinic for the mentally ill. The mentally ill 41-year-old sadist had already changed several places of treatment. Theodor already had connections among the Nazis and then helped Hitler implement the Night of the Long Knives. Therefore, he immediately found use as one of the most strategic punishers in the SS. How come? It's just that it was he who'd later lead the 3rd Tank Division of the named paramilitary structure. It will be called Death's Head, and a student of any country knows about its dubious and horrendous deeds today. In addition to this, he inspected the concentration camps of the so-called Central Zone. personally contributing to the increase in their number. The psycho was uncontrollable, cruel, corrupt, and greedy. But he had a powerful patron in the NSDAP, SS Chief Himmler. Thanks to Eicke's direct efforts, even more people went to the grave than in the camps of Adilo Globocnik. His Totenkopf and 4 concentration camps disposed of a total of 2.5 million to 3 million civilians. Having drunk schnapps, he often liked to start quarrels and fights out of nowhere. Since the man didn't have any sense of humor, he was quickly offended. He became especially vicious. Mental deviations worsened after the foot of one of his legs was torn apart by a Soviet mine. The 11th son in the family of a feeble-minded mother was already rushing at everyone. In 1943, the plane, the passenger of which was a psycho, was shot down near Kharkov by Soviet troops. The remains of the fascist fell on the outskirts of the village of Artelnoye, but the exact burial place of the commander of the multinational Totenkopf is still unknown. Hildegard Neumann. Despite her relatively short experience in the concentration camp system, this outwardly very beautiful woman became a real nightmare for people of Jewish nationality. Starting with training in Ravensbrück in 1944, Neumann proved herself so well that for savage cruelty to prisoners, she was transferred to work in her homeland, to Czechoslovakia. While there, Neumann worked as a senior warden at the Theresienstadt concentration camp. The camp was considered exemplary. Its second name is Ghetto for the Elderly. All older Jewish people were brought into this camp. But where did more than 120,000 of the 130,000 prisoners go? About 90,000 people were sent to Auschwitz for extermination, and Neumann had a hand in this, personally deciding who was to be sent to practically inevitable death. At least 33,000 more died in the camp itself. And again, Hildegard Neumann played an important role in this. In fact, since 1944, Neumann decided the fate of hundreds and thousands of Jews who, by the will of fate, ended up in this death camp. Unfortunately, before the liberation of the camp, the soulless Nazi disappeared, and her fate was unknown. Only in the beginning of the 21st century was it established that Hildegard Neumann quietly and peacefully lived out her life until the end of her days, got married, gave birth to 2 children, and happily died with her family at the age of 92. Other historians are sure that this is fake information. Be that as it may, the merciless executioner escaped the well-deserved punishment. Friedrich Wegener. Friedrich was born in Bremen, being the son of a surgeon. This determined his professional fate, and the young man became addicted to autopsies of corpses at an early age, becoming a pathologist. And he also studied tumors. But what attracted an 18-year-old young guy to the NSDAP? Most likely, a few months before the final coming to power of the National Socialists, he had already accurately predicted their success and just wanted to make a career as a scientist as soon as possible. This is a version where he hurried up in time. But for this version to be accurate, Friedrich could serve the NSDAP in some other way. Why was it necessary to join the ranks of soldiers? The answer is only this one. In order to directly take part in armed showdowns and have access to still warm corpses. At the start of the creation of Hitler's empire, Wegener launched his scientific activity to the fullest extent. Even then, the brilliant and equally vicious physician dreamed of experiments on the Untermensch. Hitler gave him such an opportunity. He could use people from the ghetto of the Polish city of Lodz for experiments. He moved to the specified city of Lodz and began his terrible activities. And then he continued it on the territory of several concentration camps. We've all heard of Dr. Death, Mengele, but Wegener surpassed him in his bloody actions. The man was less hyped by society. No books, no investigations or films have been written about him. Meanwhile, the experimental drugs he tested sent hundreds of thousands of not mice or monkeys, but Homo sapiens, Jews from ghettos and prisoners of concentration camps. The poor fellows died in cruel torment, but there is something that would have frightened even Mengele himself. Wegener dissected the bodies of still living patients. He, so to speak, needed to carry out an objective control of the organs after the injections. Strange as it may be, but the tribunal over the fascist villains did not find any sense in the character of this chapter. The fact is that he did not have any units of the power machine of the Third Reich. The young man didn't show up enough. At that time, many Germans had a party card of a member of the NSDAP. Doctors, reporters, teachers, architects, engineers, and business executives. Consequently, the involvement of the pathohistologist in war crimes was not proven. He died in 1990. Maria Mandel. The Austrian woman was born into an inconspicuous family. In Münzkirchen, the shoemaker's daughter was only able to achieve the post of postman, and even then she had to move to Switzerland for this position. Special talents manifested themselves in the 26-year-old holder of the NSDAP ticket in 1938. She moved to Germany, specifically to Munich, where she was registered as a guard of one of the first concentration camps. It was located to the north, in Saxony. If you didn't know, there were death camps inside the Aryan Empire even before the start of the Second World War. Since at first, Germany cleansed itself of second-class people. It disposed of communists, Jews, and everyone who looked like them, and later homosexuals of both sexes and even some especially hopeless criminals. The security structure where Mundell got a job was considered an auxiliary service of the SS. At one time, the SS was only the security and escort department of the Reich. But with the outbreak of hostilities in the occupation of European countries, the SS became precisely the punishment machine. And along with it, most of the security guards of the structure. For example, Mundell, for her special enthusiasm for the work entrusted to her, in 1942 received the post of head of the women's departments in the Auschwitz-Birkenau camps, and at the same time excellent housing, food, and salary. On the conscience of the person discussed here are at least 500,000 prisoners, sometimes directly with children. She made it to this list because she was one of those who supplied women to the demon doctor Josef Mengele. Also because she ordered the murder of any representative of the fair sex who dared to look at her in Auschwitz. She chose kind of pets from among the Jews. When she got tired of a certain group, she forced her subordinates to destroy them and looked for new pets for herself. This was the highest way of self-assertion in the life of this young lady, who was not remarkable for anything else. The last gloomy circumstance of her activity was the flogging of prisoners. At the end of the summer of 1945, Mandel was arrested by the US Army. The proceedings against her crimes were so protracted that they lasted even after Nuremberg. There were many witnesses in the case from whom the court learned something more interesting. Maria created an orchestra of prisoners. It played as the women's rows mournfully moved into the gas chambers. During the entire trial of her, she pitifully asked for pardon, but in 1948 she was hanged. Friedrich Wilhelm Krüger. Krüger is guilty of murdering 1.5 million civilians in Poland. That is how many people are on his conscience and the conscience of his subordinates, and he managed to command both the SA detachments, miraculously surviving after the Night of the Long Knives, and the SS detachments. The future Hitlerite was born in Strasbourg in a military family, which predetermined his fate. Being a strong young man, he became a lieutenant of the 25th Prussian Infantry Regiment after studying in a military institution. During the First World War, he made his way to the adjutant of this regiment, and between the wars, he managed not only to marry successfully, but also to join the SS. But then he left to join the SA only to graze the SS again later, during the next war. In general, this man seems to have decided to try on all the uniforms of the Third Reich throughout his life. He was sure that every single one of them suited him in the best possible way. What are his crimes? He was in charge of suppressing the resistance throughout Poland. Being in this country, for each killed Nazi, this terrible guy ordered to shoot at least 5 random passers-by. In this way, hundreds of thousands of innocent ethnic Poles were shot and hanged. Moreover, the cynical bastard gave instructions to send several 100,000 people to concentration camps. But that's not all. It was he who led the destruction of all infrastructure and all supplies during the retreat of the Wehrmacht, after which many people later died of starvation. As a result, in terms of the number of victims, Krüger, who escaped the Night of the Long Knives, can be put alongside the outright uncontrollable psycho Eike, the marauder Globocnik, and the necrophilic molester Delewanger. Equally important, he also rotted away pretty much all the professors and cultural figures who did not want to glorify the ideals of the Third Reich. Moreover, there is a well-known case of 200 children who were kidnapped from Polish families and transferred to German families for subsequent Germanization. He ordered this to be done, being an SS Obergruppenführer, and at the same time the chief of the Reich police in Lodz. It was he, and no one else, who showed the greatest effort in depriving many Poles of their self-identification. And in 1944, Hitler promoted him to the rank of General of the Waffen-SS, and Himmler made him the chief representative in the southern branch of the SS. The Red Army entered Poland, but Krüger was no longer there. He was sent in advance to command the 5th Mountain Corps on the southeastern front. A year later, he was almost captured in Upper Austria and later committed suicide. Ernst Kaltenbrunner. It was he who, at its essence, established 3 main methods of killing prisoners of all concentration camps, these being deadly gas, noose, and bullet, and he himself, more than once, was present at executions. In general, he was a fighter, by the nature of his irrepressible and extremely bloodthirsty character, a true Nazi fighter. Against Jews, communists, anti-fascists, homosexuals, those who doubt the ideas of Germany at the time, and so on. In a single word, with all the enemies of the Reich and with everything that he considered evil for the Reich itself. People like Ernst Kaltenbrunner were absolutely biggest bet when it came to Adolf Hitler's plan of conquering the world. Such loyal, devoted dogs, ready to bite and destroy any of his enemies. Therefore, when, in 1942, the British Secret Services, with the help of the local underground, eliminated Himmler's deputy and the head of the RSHA, Reinhard Heydrich, Hitler, apparently, had no doubts who should take the post. From January of 1943, Kaltenbrunner officially became the head of the RSHA and Himmler's deputy. In June 1943, he received another rank of SS Obergruppenführer. After the appointment of Kaltenbrunner, the extermination of concentration camp prisoners, including Jews, intensified even more. Kaltenbrunner demanded from his subordinates much greater efficiency in solving the tasks facing them. It's clear what these tasks were: the massive extermination of Jews, Roma, Slavic people, and everyone who interfered with the operations of the Reich. Until the very end of the World War II, Kaltenbrunner kept under his control the entire sadistic machine of the Third Reich, designed to massively exterminate people who were undesirable or dangerous to the Nazi regime. He demanded the extermination of as many prisoners as possible, especially closer to the defeat of Nazi Germany, so that only those who were still capable of hard labor were left. As early as April 20, 1945, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was present when Hitler addressed one of the last capable soldiers of Third Reich, young Hitlerjugend, or Hitler Youth, in his bunker. And the very next day after this happened, the hardened Nazi, in a hurry, left Berlin. However, he was arrested by American intelligence on May 12, 1945, less than 1 month later. Ernst hid in the mountains, not far from the Austrian town of Altuszi. He was identified by a local shepherds, and accordingly reported to the burgomaster, and he to the search party of the Americans. And by this moment, some strange things came to light. It turns out that apart from narrow specialists, in this case representatives of special services and military intelligence, in the political circles of the Allies, few people knew who Kaltenbrunner essentially was. One of the most influential Nazis of the Third Reich and the organizers of mass murder and the Holocaust, for a long time managed to remain not a very noticeable figure in the world political arena. At the same time, Kaltenbrunner survived 2 cerebral hemorrhages, and at one time in his life he moved in a wheelchair. How much this was really so, or whether there was skillful acting for the public eyes, we will never know. But neither the complete denial of his complicity in the crimes of Nazism and the SS, nor his illness, helped Kaltenbrunner to escape responsibility for his atrocious acts. On October 1, 1946, by the verdict of the Nuremberg court, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was found guilty of countless atrocities and sentenced to death by hanging. On the night of October 15th to 16th, he, along with the other 11 Nazis sentenced to death, was hanged. That was X-War history. Thank you for watching our episode. If you want to see other episodes we have on this channel, you can see options on the screen. Subscribe to get notified when new episodes come out and leave a like. See you later.